Good morning, bon dia, buenos dias, bonjour, guten Morgen, good morgon, ni hao, nai ho. It's such a pleasure to be here today. Thank you to the conference organizing team, and in particular to Dean Daniel Lai, who I had the pleasure of meeting in Montreal last spring, for inviting me to deliver this keynote address. Today, I want to think with you all about regional GPTs, linguistic pluralism, and the possible reconfiguration, or at the very least, the rethinking of global AI power. In addition to serving as chair of a diverse Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures in Montreal, one that brings together Spanish, German, Russian, and Italian, within a city that itself sits at a linguistic tension point between French and English. I have worked within the field of digital humanities for over a decade, with a particular focus on multilingual projects and how to understand the digital outside of the confines, but always in dialogue with the global north. I have also very recently been involved in curricular development for McGill's new fully online master's degree in multilingual digital communications within the School of Continuing Studies. During my tenure at McGill, I have taught undergraduate and graduate courses in digital methods, including web analytics, mapping, and large-scale text mining. Much of that work has centered on the global south, with Latin America and the Caribbean as my home base. Over the past decade, our digital humanities students at McGill have consistently worked across languages, geographies, and digital infrastructures, treating multilingual digital environments not as marginal cases, but as sites of negotiation, policies, and power. So here are some of the students that I have personally supervised across the last 10 years. What I've noticed that is by the early 2020s, this has become a sustained computational research method. So modeling archives, mapping networks, analyzing multilingual metadata, tracing translation flows across multiple language ecologies, across Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, German, Italian, Chinese, and English corpora. Multilingualism has functioned not simply as content for my students, but as method. And today, that trajectory extends directly into AI. As my MA student, Anna Legault, asks in her work, if language is spatial, what kind of linguistic environments are LLMs designing? Looking back, many of these earlier projects were already grappling with the infrastructural asymmetries that AI now amplifies. My own research examines how computational methods reshape the ways we read, map, and interpret cultural systems at scale, particularly in regions shaped by colonial entanglements, linguistic negotiation, and uneven technological infrastructures. While my empirical focus today remains primarily in Latin America, I am attentive to how asymmetries of power, colonial histories, infrastructural dependencies, and ongoing ecocide, to also gesture back to Neil's talk, resonate across different contexts, including here in Hong Kong. For many years, digital humanities debates revolved around corpus design, metadata, modeling, and epistemological implications of quantitative analysis. But any contemporary discussion of DH can no longer proceed without reckoning with the extraordinary landscapes opened up and fundamentally shifted by artificial intelligence. Large language models not only have introduced new tools, they have restructured the terrain of digital inquiry itself. Or, as Lauren Klein recently remarked, DH has won. But that triumph is inseparable from how AI has already reshaped higher ed and its research questions, its workflows, and increasingly its sense of what counts as knowledge. What it means to win and who is left behind in that triumph are questions that demand pause and reflection. If the digital is now ubiquitous, if one can access high-speed internet in the mountainous regions of Guatemala, what precisely are the ruptures in this ubiquity? Much of the current conversation around AI is organized around scale. We speak of foundation models, we speak of planetary infrastructures and global deployment. The dominant narrative suggests that more data, more parameters, more compute, and broader multilingual integration will naturally produce more inclusive systems. But what if the problem is not scale itself? What if the problem is how scale is structured? In Digital Encounters in Contemporary Latin America, a co-volume I co-edited in 2023, we argue that Latin American digital cultural production does not merely imitate technological developments from the global north, it generates alternative epistemologies of digitality, forms of networked practice shaped by linguistic plurality, material constraint, and experimental adaptation. Digital life in Latin America has long been marked by hybridity, improvisation, and multilingual negotiation. It operates within global infrastructures, but it does not simply reproduce them. It recalibrates them. It translates them. It repurposes them. That insight becomes newly urgent in the age of large language models, because the question before us is not how to make AI systems more multilingual. It is how linguistic plurality reshapes the distribution of epistemic power within global AI architectures. When we speak of regional GPTs, then, we're not only speaking about technical fine-tuning, we're asking whether locality can function as an epistemic intervention within infrastructures designed for universality, and more often than not, trained in English. Before mapping specific initiatives, we must pause on the structural constraints within which such interventions operate. Most contemporary transformer models rely on tokenization schemes originally optimized for English or for multilingual corpora in which English dominates. English remains the primary language of the web, as you'll see in this slide, often estimated to constitute a disproportionately large share of digitized content relative to many other languages. When tokenizers are trained on English-heavy corpora, subword segmentation patterns encode assumptions about morphology, frequency, and semantic proximity that reflect English linguistic structures. If the most granular unit of model understanding, the token, is shaped by English dominance, then sovereignty cannot be reduced to dataset substitution alone. We must call this a form of digitization bias. Large language models are trained not on language as lived, but on language as digitized. Communities whose textual traditions remain oral, non-standardized, or unevenly archived enter the model only partially, if at all. The curation paradox emerges. Who decides what constitutes the corpus of human knowledge from which models learn? And I should also mention that AI eventually is going to replace search altogether, and we see AI increasingly integrated into search. So these models are trained, how these models are trained matters even more, and it will continue to matter as we move forward. So in a computational ecosystem where only a handful of institutions possess the resources to curate and train frontier-scale data sets, the gatekeeping function of curation becomes a site of concentrated power. Scaling laws further complicate this landscape. The prevailing assumption is that increasing compute, parameters, and training data yields incremental improvements in model performance. More scale appears to generate greater fluency, coherence, and conceptual abstraction. Yet, conceptual abstraction does not emerge in a vacuum. It emerges from probability distributions shaped by existing linguistic hierarchies and culturally specific systems of categorization. Even if models appear to operate at the level of conceptual relationships rather than specific languages, those relationships are statistically grounded in imbalanced corpora whose digitization histories are uneven and politically structured. So we must ask, how can we optimize for non-English linguistic realities when the fundamental optimizer has been trained within English-dominant environments? It is within these constraints that recent efforts to develop regionally grounded large language models reveal both promise and limitation. And once we see that the unit of computation, the token, and the archive of training, the digitized corpus, are already politically structured, the question becomes, what kind of meaning spaces are these systems building? As my MA student, Anna Legault, explores in her current thesis, language is already a spatial system of cultural meaning. Human languages organize experience for culturally specific patterns of association, hierarchy, and categorization. Large language models, in turn, convert words into vectors, mapping conceptual proximity numerically across high-dimensional space. But conceptual closeness in these models is not neutral. It is shaped by the statistical environment of the training data and by the uneven digitization of cultural knowledge. In this sense, LLMs do not simply represent language, they redesign the spatial architecture of meaning itself. If sovereignty once concerned territorial control and later data governance, we might understand it as a question of who designs the map of conceptual proximity through which meaning flows, and who bears responsibility for the consequences of that design. Regional GPTs then are not only about adding more languages to a system, they're about intervening in the geometry of knowledge production. We are testing this proposition empirically in an ongoing set of projects at McGill, examining cultural sensitivity and story moral generation. Working with the mini WorldLit dataset, which is a multilingual dataset, our team designed a study using 14 stories drawn from different distinct regional language pairs. Each story was machine translated into all other languages in the set, resulting in 196 story versions. We then collected human annotation of story morals from regionally situated readers, participants located in Japan and fluent in Japanese, for example, allowing us to compare culturally grounded moral interpretation across linguistic contexts. We next evaluated large language models on the same task, generating story morals for each version of the text. The finding is striking. The red reference line in our analysis represents the level of cross-lingual agreement among humans. Most models fall significantly to the right of that line, meaning their moral interpretations are more similar across languages than people are. In other words, while human readers diverge in culturally meaningful ways, the models converge. They tend towards generalized, universalizing lessons, smoothing cultural difference rather than preserving it. Our next step, led by our first student, Sophie Wu, and now Jaya Bonelli, is to build custom models trained on culturally specific narrative data sets to test whether we can maintain relevance while increasing cultural diversity and alignment. The question is not simply whether a model can generate a moral, it is whether it can generate one that reflects the interpretive traditions of linguistic communities. What we see in this narrative experiment echoes a broader dynamic in contemporary AI development. Across the world and in minority language contexts more broadly, we see a range of really cool experiments. These initiatives do not form a single terrain. They form a spectrum of strategies. LATAM GPT, which I'll be speaking about later, seeks to embed Latin American Spanish and Portuguese corpora into its training pipelines, articulating sovereignty primarily as representational correction and data governance within shared open source architectures. Rather than pursuing full infrastructural independence, it emphasizes regional dataset construction, evaluation benchmarks, and governance frameworks. Here, sovereignty becomes layered rather than absolute. Laxta, developed for the Basque language, and I recently spoke with a number of their developers, operates within a low resource paradigm. It foregrounds careful corpus curation and community collaboration to ensure Euskara, or Basque, remains visible within generative AI systems historically dominated by Spanish, French, and English. Sovereignty here is closely linked to linguistic vitality and cultural survival, rather than geopolitical autonomy. Elsewhere, we see more capital-intensive models. JAIS, developed in the United Arab Emirates and trained from scratch using sovereign compute infrastructures, represents a high capital, full stack model of autonomy. So here are some of the models, the regional and sovereign AI models. Yet, this autonomy required extraordinary financial investment, perhaps, but not only possible in the UAE, and access to elite supercomputing capacity. Even so, it does not necessarily outperform frontier models developed by larger US-based laboratories. Full stack sovereignty is technically possible, but often economically unfeasible. Singapore's Sea Lion initiative first pursued from scratch training across 11 Southeast Asian languages before pivoting to hybrid strategies to build atop existing open source architectures. Rather than insisting on infrastructural purity, the project reframed sovereignty around culturally specific alignment layers and safety protocols. India's Savrem-1 integrates custom tokenizer design and code mix corpora to reflect sociolinguistic realities, suggesting that sovereignty may reside as much in tokenizer design and the encoding of local category systems as in model scale. Incuba LM, which I'll show you later, developed in South Africa, demonstrates that smaller models trained carefully on regionally specific data can in fact outperform larger systems in African language tasks. Taken together, these cases reveal a consistent pattern. Fully from scratch sovereign models remain rare. Most regional initiatives built atop base architectures developed elsewhere. As a result, sovereignty increasingly shifts from foundation weights to data governance, tokenizer design, alignment protocols, evaluation practices, and institutional accountability and sustainability. I want to pause on the notion of sustainability piece for a moment, because in the Global South, this is extraordinarily important. In places like Latin America, there's often a momentum around an initiative of large-scale digital projects, but the need for long-term resources to house, update, and protect these projects is truly there. Cultural sovereignty, then, does not reside solely in base parameters. It resides in the infrastructure, data sets, linguistic assumptions, and governance regimes that shape model behavior. Sovereignty becomes layered, partial, and negotiated rather than ongoing and absolute. And yet, even partial sovereignty matters, because each intervention, whether tokenizer redesign, corpus curation, inclusion of low-resource languages, culturally specific alignment layers, or human-centered oversight, reweights the probability landscape. It redistributes representational density. It alters what appears statistically normal. Regional GPTs do not dismantle global AI monopolies. I'll go back to them briefly. What they do is they introduce friction. This also connects with our first speaker. They create space for universities, cultural institutions, and governments and educators to participate in shaping AI futures that are plural rather than universal, relational rather than extractive, and attentive to linguistic and cultural care. The question then is not whether regional models replace global models. The question is whether they meaningfully recalibrate the distribution of epistemic authority and responsibility within AI ecosystems. And one can only imagine what might be possible if two or more of these models work together. To make these differences more concrete, I want to briefly share with you something that we're working on and we're really excited about at McGill. This is a new project that we're developing to compare responses across regional language models. I'm working with AI consultants Ethan Jones on this, and also with background research from Daniel Flippo. This LLM regional comparison tool allows us to run the same prompt across multiple systems trained in different linguistic and cultural environments, using models developed for Brazilian Portuguese, Basque, African languages, Spanish, Southeast Asian languages. So here's the main interface. This is very much in the beta stage, but I think it's nevertheless really important to show you. The goal is not to determine which model is best, but to observe how different training environments produce different kinds of responses, even when the input is identical. Each of these models has been trained under different constraints, different corpora, different compute resources, different tokenizers, different alignment pipelines, and different institutional priorities. So let's watch this run, shall we? My question is, tell me something interesting. So, because the prompt is open-ended, the model must decide what counts as interesting, and that decision reflects the statistical world in which it was trained. Some responses are highly standardized, some draw on regionally specific language, some are slower, some are less stable, some are more conversational. What counts as interesting also changes, from a mushroom forest in the Brazilian Portuguese model, so lembro-me de ler sobre uma espécie de floresta de cogumelos, to immortal jellyfish in Basque. Notice that the model responds in English to the English prompt in Basque, but it responds in Portuguese in the case of the Brazilian model. To an error response in the South African model, you'll see that in a moment. To thinking about why honey never spoils in the model from Singapore. What we see here is that these models are not generating language from the same archive. They are generating from different probability landscapes shaped by different infrastructures, cultural norms, linguistic patterns, and epistemologies. And this is why sovereignty in AI cannot be understood at the level of model size or benchmark performance. It is embedded in the entire pipeline. What data exists, what data is digitized, what data is curated, what data is allowed to be used, and who has the resources to build the system. All of these questions matter. One of the most intriguing aspects of contemporary large language models is that they do not possess language preference in any human sense. They do not think in English, or Basque, or Spanish, or Portuguese, or Cantonese. They operate in probability space, mathematical representation of tokens embedded in high-dimensional vector architectures. What appears to us as language internally is a set of weighted statistical relationships between subword units. That is why at times when prompted in one language, you may have seen this in your own use of GPTs. Models may generate fragments or intermediate reasoning traces in another language. The optimization process is not bound to a single linguistic surface, but moves across pathways that maximize predictive coherence within the geometry it has learned. In that sense, AI does not inhabit language as identity or culture. It traverses language as structure. Yet, that structure itself is historically conditioned by the corpora on which it was trained. The visible output may be multilingual, but the underlying logic is computational rather than linguistic. That distinction complicates both the fear that models are inherently Anglocentric and that the optimism that they are naturally language neutral. So as frontier models consume vast quantities of publicly available web text and also vast quantities of water, quite frankly, to draw on this idea of ecocide and some of the data centers that exist in Brazil and Chile. But going back to publicly available web text and licensed data sets, researchers increasingly confront the question of data saturation. The era in which simply scaling English language web corpora guaranteed dramatic performance gains is beginning to narrow. Across the AI ecosystem, attention is turning towards new reservoirs of machine-readable text. Recently digitized archives, optical character recognition or OCR projects, multilingual repositories, audiovisual files, and historically under-digitized corpora. In this sense, the next frontier, I would argue, of large language model training may not lie only in more compute, but in newly digitized linguistic terrains. As more cultural, governmental, and archival materials are converted into machine-readable form across Latin America, Africa, and Asia, they become statistically available to model training pipelines. Digitization, thus, becomes not only a preservation project, but a potential site of extraction, raising urgent questions about consent, governance, stewardship, and accountability in the age of AI. A compelling illustration of regional AI intervention is LATAM GPT. So this is a Latin American example. Here I say hola, and then the model responds in Spanish, ¿En qué te puedo ayudar hoy? And then we continue our conversation. So a compelling example is this model, which is a collaborative language model led by Chile's National Center for International Intelligence, or SENA, and supported by over 30 institutions across 8 Latin American countries. One thing I want to stress is how important intergovernmental organization around these regional GPTs is, because in regions like Latin America, the only way for these to happen is through cooperation. Unlike commercial systems developed in Silicon Valley, LATAM GPT is being trained on regionally sourced Spanish and Portuguese-centered corpora, including court decisions, school texts, library archives from across the region, with a corpus exceeding 8 terabytes of text and approximately 50 billion parameters. This is around the same order for those of you who might remember GPT 3.5, but structurally focused on regional knowledge. LATAM GPT's goals foreground representational correction and data governance within open source infrastructures, rather than pursuing full sovereign compute independence. Its design reflects an explicitly collaborative federation of universities, governments, and nonprofits that seek to democratize AI across Latin America and ensure that local linguistic patterns, cultural references, and policy contexts are taken seriously in model behavior. But the project's ambition also exposes structural constraints. Sustainable AI sovereignty in Latin America depends not only on assembling regional data, but on sustained political will. long-term institutional coordination, transparent governance, and the retention of talent that might otherwise migrate to the global north. Sovereignty is not decreed. It is built through persistent infrastructure, protected budgets, and real adoption in public services. What makes LAT-MGPT particularly important as a case study is this dual logic. It is neither a token correction task nor an imitation of Western sovereign models like JIAS. Instead, it occupies a layered and negotiated sovereignty, where regional data, open governance, and shared infrastructure collectively reweight the probability landscape of AI output without claiming full architectural independence. What becomes clear when we examine these initiatives closely is that sovereignty rarely resides in a single place. It emerges through a constellation of architectures, institutions, and communities. If sovereignty in the age of AI is layered, infrastructural, and negotiated, then its success cannot be measured solely by benchmark scores or parameter counts. As I have seen in my own experimentation with LAT-MGPT and other regional models in Latin America, one limitation is speed. LAT-MGPT is notably in the development stage, and as you recall from the demo I showed you, some of these models are very slow. They also have no app at the moment that you can download, so there's no app for your phone, though it does have an interface chatbot that one can experiment with on a web-based platform. In this way, accessibility for certain regional GPTs is an ongoing challenge. Indeed, they may not outperform frontier US-based systems or on every generalized evaluation metric, but speed is not the only metric that matters. In certain regional contexts, they are more contextually precise. The answers are better. They're more culturally attuned and more accountable to the linguistic communities they're designed to serve. Slowness, in this sense, can in fact be a feature rather than a flaw. It reflects deliberation, thinking, governance, and infrastructural care rather than frictionless extraction. Yet models do not transform ecosystems on their own. Adoption depends on literacy. If regional GPTs are to function as meaningful epistemic interventions rather than symbolic gestures, digital literacy must begin early on. Students need to not only access AI systems, but they need the capacity to understand how they work, how they're trained, and how they reshape knowledge. Digital literacy around usage, how to prompt, evaluate, verify, and critique model outputs matters just as much as enriching the training data. A model trained on regional corpora cannot recalibrate epistemic authority if its users default to global systems out of habit, speed, or convenience. This is where education and civic participation become central to AI sovereignty. User-generated data for regional models can be strengthened through citizen science initiatives, community archiving projects, multilingual annotation efforts, and participatory corpus building. Crowdsourced input, where ethically governed, allows communities not only to consume AI outputs, but to co-produce the linguistic infrastructures that shape them. In this sense, sovereignty is not only a technical condition, but a social practice. So at McGill, this work is already underway. Through the Text Lab, directed by my colleague Andrew Piper, students across languages are participating in multilingual corpus building, annotation, and large-scale narrative modeling. An upcoming project, which actually you can participate in as well, a world map of story morals, represents our first explicitly multilingual citizen science initiative. Drawing on the mini worldlet dataset, the project invites participants to assess how moral values are expressed and distributed across stories from different linguistic traditions. Launching initially in Spanish, German, and Japanese, with Chinese to come, it experiments with participatory annotation as a way of mapping ethical and narrative variation across cultures. Rather than treating AI training data as a closed resource curated by a handful of institutions, this model opens literary and moral interpretation to distributed public engagement. Students are not simply analyzing these texts, they are helping design infrastructures through which multilingual meaning is gathered, evaluated, and structured. Regional GPTs will not dismantle global AI monopolies overnight. They cannot create alternative circuits of knowledge production, slower, more accountable, and more contextually grounded, however. The future of linguistic pluralism in AI will depend not only on who controls compute, but on who participates in training data, who learns to question model outputs, and who sees themselves reflected in the architectures of meaning being built. Sovereignty then is not only about reweighting probability landscapes, it is about cultivating informed publics capable of navigating and reshaping the very digital infrastructures that increasingly mediate our collective realities. In our story moral experiment, this is my last slide, we saw something simple and profound. Humans diverge. We interpret differently. We locate value in distinct narrative arcs. We disagree in ways that reflect history, memory, culture, and lived experience. The models, by contrast, converge. If AI is to remain accountable to the worlds from which languages emerge, it must learn not only to generalize it, but to respect divergence. Regional GPTs, citizen annotation projects, multilingual corpus building, these are not merely technical adjustments. They are attempts to ensure that difference remains visible within systems built to smooth it away. The future of AI will not be solely decided in data centers. It will be shaped in classrooms, in archives, in community projects, in the careful work of translation and interpretation. If regional models and participatory projects like ours matter, it's because they keep open a space for accountability, to language as lived, to culture as contested, and to the communities who have too often been treated as data rather than authors of their own meaning. Thank you so much.